Hi there, this is Ford Giesbrecht, and welcome to this series on triads as they apply on the guitar neck. Most of my students don't come from a theoretical background, so don't expect the kind of vernacular you would get in a college course. This series of short lessons is designed to take you from the ground up. What is a triad? What do they look like? How do they function? And ultimately, how do you use them in improvisation, in making melodies, in making chords? If you study these short lessons in order, in no time at all, you'll be using triads to your advantage, and you'll see how they open up the neck. So with that, let's get started. Lesson 1. What is a triad and where did they come from? So today we're going to talk about triads. By definition, a triad is a three-note chord. For our purposes, we're going to see how that applies to the major scale. Now, major scale is found on a piano, let's say. All the notes a piano can play, and therefore all the notes you can play on a guitar, which is ultimately where we're going to end up. But first, let's look at the piano. So if you have one handy, if you look at the piano, the first thing you notice, of course, is the color coding. There's white keys and there's black keys. So the white keys are the letter names, and the black keys are the sharps and flats. We're not going to deal with sharps and flats right now. We're just going to concern ourselves with the letter names, which are the first 7 letters of the alphabet. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. The C scale is called the neutral scale because there's no sharps and flats. In other words, all the white notes of the piano is a C scale. If we want it to sound like a C scale, we have to start on C. So that would be the first objective. Let's go find C. So if you look at the patterns, you'll see 2 blacks and then 3 blacks, and that pattern repeats. If you go directly to the left of the 2 blacks, that note is C. And you'll see there's a whole bunch of them, probably 11, give or take. So if you play just all the white notes from that, you would get C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. It'd be too easy if the scale would have started like A, like our alphabet, but it doesn't. And it doesn't because of the way the notes lay out. Because you'll see 2 places where there's no black note in between the white notes. So if you count it up, well, let me just say it like this. You may or may not have heard the term tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. Now, in my experience, I've asked that question, and some people have heard that, and some people haven't heard that, and most people can't explain, even if they have heard it, what exactly that means. And what it means is if you start on C and end on C, you see there's not an even number of notes. There's these 2 places where there's no black note in between. So the distance between any 2 notes on a piano is called either a half step or a semitone. On a guitar, that equals 1 fret. But let's look at the piano. So if we start with C, you'll see there's a black note between C and D, between D and E, and then E and F, no black note. And then F to G, G to A, and A to B have black notes, and then B to C, no black note. So that's where the terminology comes from. Tone, tone, semitone. Distance between C and D is a whole step, or a whole tone, because there's a black note in between. So in E and F, those 2 notes are a half step apart. So if you played all the letter names from C to C, it would just sound like a C scale. So from here, how we were going to establish what a triad is by taking every other note and its letter names. It's no black notes required. That's why we're using a C scale. Every other note would be C, skip D, E, skip F, and G. And triad, 3-note chord. So we're not going to skip one more and end up with a 7. We just want 3 notes. The root, the third, and the 5th. And we can consider those 7 letters by a number, 1 through 7. And the name of the scale gets an R for root. If it's a C scale, and if it's a C chord then, every other note, you'd call it the root, the 3rd, and the 5th, because those are the degrees of the scale that our chord is comprised of. So that's it. We're going to disregard everything else, and let's just take those 3 letters, C, E, and G. Now, unlike English, you can't spell book B-O-K-O, but in music you can. So we can spell our C chord, C-E-G, E-G-C, or G-C-E. You may say, well, what about C-G-E? And the answer to that is you can't do that on 3 adjacent strings unless you have Spider-Man fingers, because you can't reach. So we're just going to do it in order. If we do it in order, they'll fit on 3 adjacent strings, and therefore they fit within 1 octave. So on a guitar, you can play an octave on 3 adjacent strings. On a piano, we'll just say you can do it with either hand. You don't need both hands for it. But that's as deep into piano as we're going. So now let's just take a look at the guitar neck. If you know the names of the strings, starting from the first string closest to the floor, the strings are E, B, G, D, A, E. And the low E is low in pitch, but it's closest to you. So the first string is closest to the floor, the 6th string is closest to your nose. So we're just going to think of it that way. So the first string closest to the floor, because it's an E string, the first note we encounter is F. So that's going to happen at the 1st fret. So if we follow our tone, tone, semitone, we're not starting at the beginning, we're actually starting at the E and the F. So E to F is a semitone, F to G is a tone, G to A is a tone. So E to F is 1 fret, F to G is 2 frets, G to A is 2 frets, etc., all the way up to the 12th fret. And at the 12th fret, it's the same letter name as the open 1st string. So that's an octave. So from the open 1st string to the 12th fret is an octave, and on a piano, the note to the left of the 2 black notes is C, and when you see that pattern repeat, that's an octave. Okay, so that's as deep as we're going into that. So let's move on. We can now play a C scale on 1 string, but on the E string, we're starting in the middle of the scale, because it would be E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E. So on the 2nd string, because it's a B string, the C note is at the 1st fret. Once again, the semitone between B and C. And then all the rest goes as follows. So if you started at the 1st fret on the 2nd string, you would get tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, and that would take you back to the 13th fret. In other words, B to C is 1 fret, C to D is 2 frets, D to E is 2 frets, E to F is 1 fret, F to G is 2 frets, G to A is 2 frets, A to B is 2 frets. That takes you to the 12th fret, and then B to C is 1 fret. So it follows that you can do that also on the 3rd string, on the 4th string, all the way to the 6th string. Now, if you practice that way, at the end of the day, you'd say, well, okay, that was fun, 1 string at a time, and if you had a neck map so you could see this, you could actually get all those tones, but when you're done, you look at the neck, and once again, our notes on the guitar are all brown. There's no color coding like on a piano. So now what do we do? Well, I think the triads are a great way to learn to get around on the neck, because there's these patterns that aren't in black and white, but they're in the configuration of your fingers. So let's take a look at that. So if we want a C chord on the first 3 strings, we could start with an open G, and that's part of our C chord, and then the first fret of the 2nd string is C, and then the open 1st string is E. So that configuration is a C chord. So then from there, on the 3rd string, if we go up to the 5th fret, we're going to encounter a C. And then if we look to the second string, also at the 5th fret, there's an E. And then at the 3rd fret of the first string is a G. So there's another configuration of a C chord. But now it's an L shape. So from there, let's go up to the 9th fret of the 3rd string and we'll encounter an E. And at the 8th fret of the second string is just G, and the 8th fret of the first string is a C. So there's another configuration of a C chord. Now each of these configurations is called an inversion. An inversion meaning an order of notes. So at the nut, we get a G, a C, and a E. Logically, I don't want to start there. Logically, I want to start at the 5th fret because that's where we get things in order. So it's just easier to think about it. So if you get a C and an E and a G, we'd call that a root inversion C chord, and that shape is consistent with all the major chords. So in other words, if we move that up according to the letter names on the 3rd string, we would get up 2 frets, you would get a D chord. If you moved it up 2 more frets, you'd get an E chord. If you moved it up 1 more fret, you'd get an F chord. So that's one way you can learn, number one, the names of the notes on the 3rd string, and also a pure triad on 3 adjacent strings. And you'll get the sound of a root inversion chord because the notes are in order, C, E to G, and then etc. Let's stick with our C chord for the moment. So on the 3rd string, if we now go up to the 9th fret and we have our E note, you could put down a finger there and then put down another finger or 2 fingers on strings 2 and 1 at the 8th fret. And that's kind of like a little mini bar chord where 2 notes at 1 fret and one finger at 1 fret higher. And that shape is called a first inversion C chord. And first inversion because the 3rd of the chord is in the root position, the lowest position. And then it would go 3rd, 5th, root. You can remember that as a first inversion chord or not. At this point, we're still going to learn these grips before it's important to think about the names of the inversions. But it's there if you need it. Okay, let's keep going. If you go up to the 12th fret, now you need fingers. At the nut, you don't need fingers because the open strings are part of the chord. So at the 12th fret, you could play your first finger on the 3rd string, your second finger on the 1st string, and your 3rd finger in between on the 2nd string, and you'd have what we often just call the D shape. But now it's at the 12th fret, and in other words, your 3rd finger is at the 13th fret, which is a C note. So if you move that all the way down to the nut, you'd find that your 1st and 2nd fingers are now unemployed, and your 3rd finger could stay on the 2nd string, although you'd never play a C chord like that if you've played your basic cowboy chords. But now you get the idea of where that shape comes from. So with that, there's lesson 1 of how to make a triad and where these things come from. So we'll leave it at that, and now we'll go to lesson 2.